everybody. Today we're talking Second Chronicles, and I'm sharing all of this information with you with my post-flu voice. So I apologize for how I sound, but it is what it is, and I want to help us get started with Second Chronicles, and we are wrapping up after we've seen the death of King David and Solomon becoming king. And so we're sort of entering into a really vital phase in the history of Israel. And a lot of times we get asked the same question. I've been asked this question so many times. Why is the Old Testament so important? Why is it valuable? Why is the history important? Why does this apply to me? Why do I need to study it? So all of these questions I've been asked multiple times. And so we talked a little bit about this in the First Chronicles video about how the Old Testament applies to us and why it is vital for us to study the history of the people of Israel. And it's because we can see Jesus in the pages of the Old Testament. We can see how God was weaving together the story of redemption from the very beginning. And it is so crucial that we sit down with these stories and see how God was working and how God was moving, even in the Old Testament, because those things apply to us as well. When we look at the history of God's people, we can see what to do and what not to do. And we can see how God's character is reflected throughout the pages of the Old Testament, and how we can begin to see Jesus, how we can begin to see this messianic prophecy coming in to the picture slowly but surely. We're seeing these pictures being painted in preparation for the Messiah to come. And so as we study the Old Testament, don't lose heart or don't say no to studying the Old Testament simply because it's old. We want to study and know God's people because we are God's people. And so we want to be able to learn the history of Israel, to understand how God loved and cared for his people in spite of them, how he disciplined them when they disobeyed, how they were exiled and went through all of these different things. And we want to see that. We want to be able to look at that. So over the course of 2020, we are walking through the second half of the Old Testament from First Chronicles through the book of Ezekiel. And so we're going to be covering a lot of ground and a lot of history and a lot of rich information that's going to point us straight to Jesus. And so we want to be good stewards of God's word. And that is what we're going to do. We are going to open God's word. We are going to steward it well. And we are going to listen for what God has to say to us about his word. So with all that said, we're in Second Chronicles, and I want to give you a little bit of history sort of before we really jump in too far. If you remember First Chronicles, we covered a lot of lineage and genealogies, histories, lists of things and people. And we saw the covenant that God made with David and how all of that came into place. And as we're sort of wrapping up First Chronicles, we see how David is preparing for the temple to be built. He is making all of these preparations for his son to build the temple. We know that David was the one that really wanted to build the temple. He had the heart, he had the design, he had all the things in place, and he wanted to be the one to tackle this for God and honor God by building the temple. But God gave that job to Solomon, to his son. And he said, this is not going to be your job. This is not going to be your thing. This is going to belong to your son. And so David really wanted to help his son prepare well and do things that needed to be done in preparation for this temple to be built. And so he was really setting him up for success in essence. And it's really important to see how David made that investment, not only in Solomon, but in the temple itself. And so he really, there were whole chapters at the end of First Chronicles that were solely focused on helping us understand how David played a role in the temple being built and being constructed, in that preparation phase for those things to be done. And so we'll see that Solomon's going to fulfill this first stage of God's promise. by taking David's throne and building the temple. So this is the first stage of God's promise. And we know that God's promise is that one would come from the line of David who would establish his throne and kingdom forever. And we know that is going to be Jesus. And so here we are seeing these seeds being dropped about the Messiah to come. And this is really important. This covenant with David is so key and so important in the coming of Jesus in the New Testament. So we see that the focus of the chronicler is not so much on major events, but it's really on the significance that Solomon had in God's plan and purpose, and how God used Solomon for his ultimate goals and ultimate purpose into bringing about the Messiah and the life and the line of the people of Israel. So this is really important, how we're seeing God building all these little pieces together, because these are not haphazard events that were just thrown together. These were purposeful and strategic and all designed by God, because we serve a sovereign God. And sovereign means that he is in control of all the things. So not only is the temple and covenant an important theme, but we see a lot about God's character as well as his focus on worship and prayer. And so if you remember from First Chronicles, we talked a lot about worship. We talked a lot about music and how that played a role within the church. And so we're going to continue to see that theme throughout Second Chronicles, because worship is so important. And we're really going to see the power and importance in God's presence. And so we talked about this too in First Chronicles. If you listen to the daily podcast, we talked about how God's presence, his dwelling, was in the temple. He dwelled in the temple. He dwelled with his people in the temple, just as he dwelled with the people in the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. And so this is where we're going to really see the importance of God's presence and his character and his power. And I challenge you as you're studying Second Chronicles to really look and keep your eyes open for God's character as you're reading, and make notes of where you see his character reflected as you go through this chapter. So the first 9 chapters are really going to set us up for the rest of the book. So for chapters 10 through 36, chapters 1 through 9, 1 through 7 really are going to chronicle Solomon and his kingship and his kingly role. So then in chapters 10 through 36, we're going to see a chronicle of the rest of Israel's history up until exile, really Judah's history, up until exile, the destruction of Jerusalem, and when Nebuchadnezzar really comes in and kicks people out, basically. So we're going to see this history of Israel through a covenant lens. And that really means we're going to be seeing Israel through God's promise, and how this promise is beginning to unfold and affect the people of God and the line of David and Solomon and the kings that came after Solomon. And so this is we're going to see after during the time of Solomon that the nation of Israel was divided into north and south. And so we see the north remains Israel and the south is Judah, which includes Jerusalem, which is where David was king, and his kingship and his line continued on through Judah and through the south, through the southern part of Israel. And so this is going to record 300 years of Judah's history as we sort of unpack all of these kings, whether they obeyed God, whether they were evil. All of this we're going to unpack as we go through Second Chronicles. And the chronicler is really seeking to encourage 5th century Jews to honor God and be worshipful by retelling what they needed to remember about God and the covenant that he made. And so, you can sort of wonder what they were thinking and what they were feeling when they came out of exile. I'm sure there was some level of discouragement or heartbreak, or, maybe even hope that they were coming out of exile and they could go home. And so it's really important to consider those things as we really dig into the context of what's happening as we open Second Chronicles and what's happening with God's people. So all of this is not without some hope as the exile decree is lifted at the end of Second Chronicles and people are allowed to return and come back to Jerusalem. And we really see that hope is there, and that God allows his children to come back home. And it really is just this beautiful picture of grace and redemption, that God allows them to come back to their dwelling place, come back to their homeland, to the place that they know and to the place that they love. And so we're really going to unpack a lot in 36 chapters and a lot of years. 300 plus years of history here is what we're going to be walking through over the next 36 days. So I encourage you to follow along with us. We will be having more videos here to help you study God's Word, but we are going to be on the podcast every day, the Displaying Grace Bible Study Podcast, every day, talking about one chapter a day of Second Chronicles. And so I encourage you to follow along with us on the daily podcast as we walk through God's Word together, and we talk about and break down some of these things that we're studying to really help us get a better understanding and a better grasp on the Old Testament and Second Chronicles and the history of the people of Israel.